All right, pre-AP biology students. This video is basically for you kids who are at home on quarantine today. The kids who are in class are going to get this lecture in class today. But again, if you want to watch it again after you've watched it in class or listen to it in class, you're more than welcome to watch this video. I want to quickly review just a couple of things that we discussed last week. Right now we're kind of in the middle of our discussion on ecology, and we're kind of focusing on sort of the population level of ecology. So we're studying population ecology. So make sure, again, we know the definition of a population. Last week, we talked about some different characteristics of populations. I mean, every population, has a size to it. Every population has a density, right? Because these are organisms that are living in one area, so we can determine their density. They have a distribution. Are they clumped or are they randomly dispersed? However they are. There's a sex ratio, right? Males to females. And we can also look at age structure. Okay, so again, these are all some things that we talked about last week. A few more things to maybe be familiar with. We talked about population inputs and outputs. Make sure we understand, how populations rarely stay the same size, right? They change over time because of these inputs, births and immigration, and the outputs are deaths and emigration. We also talked last week a little bit about, and we're going to talk more about this today, actually, but like it's just how populations grow and sort of what limits their growth. We talked about limiting factors. And these are things in the environment that tend to put pressure on a population and kind of keep it in check so it doesn't like grow out of control. Again, we'll talk about that more again today. All right. So again, just a review on some of the topics. Age structure, we talked about that as well. Make sure you can interpret an age structure graph. There's been a couple of questions in the homework over something like this, so that's kind of an important thing to be able to do. All right. Now today, and this is in your notes on slide number 58. I want to start off today talking a little bit about something called exponential growth, otherwise known as something called biotic potential. Um, Biotic potential or exponential growth sort of occurs when conditions are ideal for a species. Imagine if a species had unlimited resources, all the food that they want, all the water they want, all the living space. Let's say there's no predators, there's very little competition. We would probably expect a population to grow and to grow fairly quickly. All right, so that's exactly what exponential growth is. It's basically growth when there's nothing limiting the population from growing. So you can probably imagine that births will far outnumber deaths when a population is growing exponentially. Now, like when would that actually be happening? I mean, could organisms actually do that? Well, we actually see this quite a bit in nature, especially a really good example of it is something called an endangered, or I should say, an invasive species. Invasive species are basically organisms that don't have anything that are limiting them. They have like ideal living conditions. And when this happens, they tend to grow at a tremendously high rate. A really good example, I'm going to give you a couple good examples today, but there are hundreds of examples out there. And feel free to do a Google search on invasive species and see like what type of species are more prominent here in Northwest Indiana or in the Midwest. But here's one of them. It's called a zebra mussel. Zebra mussels are not native to the United States. They came over here back in the late 70s, early 80s. I believe they're from Asia, if I'm not mistaken. I might be incorrect about that. But anyway, they made their way over here basically on ships, and they made their way into the Great Lakes. And I'm going to show you a little map here. This is back in 1989, and these little red dots, you'll notice this particular area right here. This is one of our Great Lakes. This is Lake Erie. This is where they mainly started. There's a couple of other dots you'll notice right here in Lake Michigan, right here near Chicago, right near Northwest Indiana. But this was back in 1989 where these initial populations of zebra mussels were located. Now, again, where these mussels normally live, they have predators that keep them in check. But over here in the Great Lakes, those predators are not existent. So, what do you think happens when you've got a species who is now living in water with no predator? Well, this is eventually what happened. Here, this is 2018, and you'll notice here that these populations of zebra mussels have spread all over the Great Lakes. They're now found in rivers and lakes all around the country. You'll notice right here, this line right in here, I'm kind of showing you with my cursor. This is the Mississippi River, which flows all the way down to Louisiana. You'll notice right down to here near New Orleans, the Gulf of Mexico, you see a bunch of them down here as well. But they're found everywhere. I mean, even out in California. Now, you might ask, well, how could a zebra mussel, that originated, let's say, in Lake Erie, how could it make its way all the way over to San Francisco? Well, it really isn't that difficult. A lot of these, again, a lot of these zebra mussels make their way over to different bodies of water on ships. If there's a ship, let's say from Japan or something, or wherever these mussels are from, that docks in San Francisco, maybe some of those mussels were attached to the ship and they just fell off, and all of a sudden now they can populate themselves in the United States. So, I mean, we have these things all over the place, and they're very, very difficult to control. Once they get into pipes, for example, they can overpopulate, clog the pipes, and stop water from flowing. That's a big issue. Females can lay over 1 million eggs in one season. And again, if there's nothing eating those eggs, if nothing's eating the mussels, then they're going to overpopulate, and they get crazy high numbers of these things in our Great Lakes. They can attach themselves to hard surfaces like boats. They can travel from one point, to another. They can withstand short periods out of the water, so they can actually live out of the water, which is kind of one way that they can be transported from one area to the next. So just some things here about the zebra mussel. You don't have to memorize all this stuff, but I just want to throw some facts in there for you about these guys. But they are an invasive species. They're not native to the United States, but again, when they came over here, the new the new habitat that they're growing in was much different from their previous habitat, and these organisms just took off. They grew exponentially. Here's another example of an invasive. This is called the kudzu vine. Again, the kudzu vine is not native to the United States. It's native to, I believe, Japan. It is Japan. But it was introduced to the United States back in the late 1800s. They brought it over here as kind of an ornamental plant. They thought it looked pretty to grow like on your front porch and things like that. And they found out that this plant, again, the living conditions in the southern part of the United States are ideal for the kudzu vine. Where they normally live in Japan, Japan actually does have winters. It does get cold there. So in the wintertime, the plant kind of dies. But in the United States, especially in the southern part of the United States, where it stays warm like all year long, this plant just doesn't die. It doesn't have any native predators. It doesn't have any um, um, harsh winter conditions, especially down in places like Georgia and Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, those places. This plant completely just overpopulates, and they call it the plant that ate the South because pictures like this are actually very common. It just grows on everything because nothing is limiting its growth. It has taken a really big economic impact. Sometimes we don't really understand, Not only does this thing overpopulate, but it costs a lot of money to control it. It says here that $100 to $500 million worth of forest productivity. For example, lumber and things that we get from the forest. We lose a lot of money because this thing just takes over and kills and damages a lot of the plants that normally would grow in the forest. Power companies spend about $1.5 million per year just to repair damaged power lines because the kudzu vine actually grows over it. So that's a big issue. So, what can we do, to help kind of control this? We could, I guess, use chemicals to help control it, but those are herbicides and those might take an environmental toll. They might be poisonous to humans and other animals. That might be an issue. You can, I guess, just go and cut it all down. That requires a lot of manpower. It probably costs money to do that. Probably not an easy thing to do. Biologically, they've actually found ways to kind of control it with goats and sheep. They can just let goats and sheep just eat it, but that might be a little bit time consuming. Another thing they've actually found out is that humans can actually eat it. Give me about 30 seconds. I'm going to be right back. I'm going to show you something. Okay. I actually found this on the internet a couple of months ago, and I ordered it, and I thought it was kind of interesting. This, if you can see it, let's see, raise it up to my camera. This is, come on, oops, get up there. This is kudzu jelly. Kudzu jelly that actually is made using the kudzu vine. I'm gonna take a little sample of it here, scooping some out with my pen. It's actually really good. Um, it has a really unique flavor to it. It's actually zesty, kind of spicy jelly. Um, it's a little cinnamony tasting, but they figure, well, we've got this plant growing everywhere. What could we do with it? Because there's so much of it. And they've actually found some marketable things to make with it. I don't know. This stuff is actually pretty good. When you come back to class, let me know. I'll let you sample some of it. It's actually kind of good. Actually, I kind of like it. It's kind of a unique taste. Anyway, um, all right. So a couple of things I want to finish up with today. We're going to talk about some graphing. Um, there's typically two different population growth model kind of graphs that we use in biology. And we use these to kind of predict, what's the size of a population at any point in time. And the first one we're going to look at is one that we should be a little bit familiar with. This is our exponential growth curve. All right, so you'll notice here, you guys might remember when we did the bacteria lab, the virtual lab, right? Some of our graphs kind of started looking like this a little bit, right? Eventually, the graph kind of changed, but this is kind of showing us what happens to populations when they're growing without any limitations. Initially, the growth is kind of slow. So right in here, we see some slow growth, but then eventually that growth speeds up and it gets much faster. This is how zebra mussels are reproducing. This is how the kudzu vine is reproducing. We call this a J-shaped curve. It's basically showing us how a population would grow if there were very few, if any, limitations to it. So J-shaped curves, exponential growth, we should be able to kind of make a connection there. We have high birth rates, low death rates, more births than deaths, or the inputs far outweigh the outputs, I should say. Can populations grow like this forever? I mean, think about the zebra mussels. I mean, eventually, I suppose they're going to run out of space. Maybe eventually there will be some type of a predator. Maybe there will be some type of an environmental factor that might slow down its growth. But it seems right now in the United States that there isn't anything. Same thing with the kudzu vine. I mean, maybe with climate change, maybe that will affect the kudzu vine's ability to grow. Who knows? But again, as long as you have ideal living conditions, you're going to have that exponential growth. Now, I want to show you just a difference here between an exponential growth curve and linear growth. Okay, I guess one comparison between the two is that both of these curves are showing growth. All right, but linear growth is more of a constant growth, whereas exponential, we're getting more growth over time. All right, so there is a difference between those two that I want to make sure that you understand. And then the final one today, this is called the logistic growth model. This is more of a realistic curve. This is kind of showing us what happens when there are limitations. Again, if you did the paramecium growth curves, if you did the virtual lab, then this should look really familiar to you. And you'll notice that there's one really important difference between this curve or this graph and, let's say, going back to this one here. And that's the presence of a carrying capacity line. Remember, carrying capacity is, the kind of a limitation on how many organisms of that species can live in that area. So, carrying capacity is kind of a sum of all these limiting factors that are putting pressure on the population. So what you end up getting here, if you'll kind of notice that we do have a little bit of exponential growth at the beginning, but eventually that exponential growth hits a point where it starts to slow down. And the closer it gets to that carrying capacity line, the more growth is going to be inhibited. So this is what we call an S-shaped curve. Notice it has kind of an S shape to it. A couple terms here and just a couple points I want you to be familiar with on this. Again, in this area of the graph right in here, here we see our exponential. Now this point right in the middle of the graph, this is what we call the inflection point. The inflection point really is where the exponential growth stops and then growth starts to slow. So anywhere above above that inflection point is where the growth is starting to slow down. When that line gets horizontal, like it will be up here, then the growth is stopping. Okay, it's not going down, it's just stopped. It's kind of like the inputs and the outputs are exactly the same, it kind of neutralizes up here. All right, but I want you to understand that once we hit that inflection point, that's where that growth curve starts to slow and eventually will stop. All right, if it goes down, then you'll have negative growth. Okay, then you'll have more deaths than you have births. Now, the inflection point, we can actually calculate it. It's K divided by 2. Remember, K is the carrying capacity. All right, so let's just say that your carrying capacity is, I don't know, 500 or something, okay? So there's 500 fish that can live in a pond. Well, if you wanted to determine what the inflection point is, just take your carrying capacity and just divide it by 2. You'll notice it's right here in the middle of this axis here, this y-axis. So whatever this carrying capacity is, exactly half of it will be that inflection point. Okay, so it's a little bit of math, but not too difficult. All right, so logistic growth, again, it's an S-shaped curve. Again, it's used to predict growth anytime we have these limiting factors, these density-dependent limiting factors that are kind of constraining the population and putting pressure on that population. But again, early growth is always exponential until it reaches that inflection point. A few things here that are kind of interesting about logistic growth. Sometimes, in fact, this happens a lot of times, especially with organisms that tend to overpopulate quickly, like insects do this a lot. Like you'll get a lot of growth, like some exponential growth amongst organisms. Let's say, I don't know, grasshoppers or mosquitoes or some insect, and they just grow rapidly. Let's say in the springtime, mosquitoes just start to overpopulate like crazy, and eventually by the summertime, they're all over the place. But sometimes you get a population that overshoots the carrying capacity. Now remember what that line represents, right? It's how many organisms that the environment can support. So if there's an overshoot, then you can expect that population to crash. You can expect it to come down. We call that a die-off. Then it might overshoot again, it might die off, it might overshoot, but you'll notice that these oscillations, we've talked about that term before, notice how these oscillations tend to get lower and lower over time. And eventually that population will reach an equilibrium. It'll kind of be in check, kind of be in balance. But I want you to understand that whenever you have this overshoot, you can predict there's going to be a die-off afterwards. Just a really good example of this here. This is St. Paul Island up in Alaska. Moose were introduced there back in 1910. And at the time, there was no predators of these moose on the island. So you can imagine what happened with those moose. They have no predators. So they had plenty of food, plenty of living space. So they began to grow exponentially, right? You'll notice the shape of this curve here. But eventually you'll notice that the population crashed. Now, the reason why that happened wasn't because there was predators. It was because they ran out of food. These moose just overpopulated and they ate all their food, and then the population completely died off. So what happened was they overshot their carrying capacity, and then they crashed, and they crashed to the point literally of extinction on that island. There are now no longer any moose there because the population crashed down to zero. So I want us to understand that these overshoots could have drastic consequences for the population. So populations kind of have to be careful, not to overshoot too much, or else they could crash and they could crash down again to extinction. All right, guys, that's it for me for today. I suggest maybe watching this video again just to make sure it kind of sinks in. Make sure you fill in the fill-in notes as well. We eventually will have a quiz over this topic or the topics covered in this lecture today. All right, guys, have a good day. I will see you soon. Take care.